name's Vinai, and I'm building a little service. This is like my promotional intro here. Mage 2 TV. My idea is to have something like Laracast, and actually, what the idea came from the Magento 1 recordings of Ben giving the Magento fundamentals training, and there's nothing like that for Magento 2. So I want to fill this void with Mage 2 TV. It's currently in beta. I wanted to have it public already, but I was working on the conference talk this week. So the platform actually is done. I just want to produce a bit more content before I switch it live. And then people can actually register and I can finally start earning some money with it. So check it out if you're interested. It's, I hope it's going to be great. All right. So for this talk, I had a bunch of, alternative titles. Maybe lessons learned from UiComponents, or these are my own best practices. But didn't sound quite as nice, so I went for the clickbait. So for this presentation, I assume you have at least a basic understanding of require.js, knockout, jQuery UI widgets, and UiComponents. So who feels he's qualifies with these requirements? Okay, not bad, very good. All right, cool, very good. So it only, a very basic understanding is good enough. You don't need to feel at home. In order to prepare, I did a little Twitter poll, and my idea was, okay, I love them when I hear Magento 2 UiComponents. It makes me swear a lot. It's complicated, and I have no opinion. But it turns out emojis aren't very explicit, right? Maybe people misunderstood it. Also, turns out the angry emoji doesn't work on some mobile clients, so it probably was a complete waste of time. Who knows? Whatever. It didn't work. I guess the lesson is I'm not good at Twitter polls. So, what's the problem beyond that? The problem is really understanding UiComponents for me was one of the hardest things I've ever did in regards to learning to program. And I'm self-educated. I didn't study computer science or anything. And my first strategy when I encountered them back a couple of years ago was I avoided them. I didn't want to work with them. I tried it. I tried to like them, failed, and just went away. But didn't work out. They're still here. And we're hearing all this nice, sexy new PWA talk, and that sounds great. But I actually had to work with these UiComponents for a while and build some stuff in them. And over time, it took quite a long time, actually. But I got the feeling now I kind of know my way around them a bit. So this talk is not an introductory talk into how to UiComponent. This is not about how not to use them. I did a talk on that before, how to, what are our alternatives if we don't want to use them. This talk is actually my survival guide, how I can develop new stuff with UiComponents and tweak the existing ones and customize them and fix bugs without losing my sanity. All right, so it still takes me quite a long time sometimes to build some stuff, even though I feel kind of proficient. And the way I tend to work with UiComponents is I read code a lot more than I read the docs. And don't get me wrong, I like the docs, I read them, but I read code all the time. I read code while I'm debugging, when I'm copying some chunk of code and trying to adjust it for my own purposes. I read my own code, trying to figure out what I was thinking yesterday. So when I'm coding, I try to optimize for readability, because that's basically what I do most of my time. So this talk, in general, will be a little bit of whining, some general advice on readable code in the context of UiComponents, and finally a bit of view state management, which is, I think, the most interesting part of it, which actually has helped me the most when working with UiComponents. So hopefully it will be useful for you too. Okay, so the whining first. I'll keep it short. I'm getting kind of sick of whining about UiComponents, to be honest. There are three main issues I encounter usually when working with UiComponents. One is of a high cognitive load. I have to keep a lot of things in my mind when trying to deal with them at the same time. And one of the reasons for that is there's a lot of duplication of knowledge, right? So I have to remember selectors and names, and I have to duplicate all this information all the time, even though the code actually is pretty similar. There's a lot of boilerplate. And finally, state management. A sane state management is not encouraged by this framework. So this section is actually for Andrew. I haven't seen him today yet, right? But if my job were to fix UI components, or at least to make them a bit better, this is basically what I was focused on. Maybe get rid of a bit of the cognitive load. That's of course mainly the whole XML part, right? It's just an annoyance, basically. You know, it's kind of okay meanwhile, but I still really don't like it. And many people just use code generation to generate that boilerplate, but we still have to go in afterwards and tweak it and deal with it, right? It's still not fun. And this is probably my biggest issue, which is the mixing of different concepts. So the front end is built with Knockout and required and jQuery UI widgets. That's not news. But those two things actually are different paradigms. With Knockout.js, we have the view model and we have the template, and in the template we refer to, through the bindings, we refer to properties and methods of the view model. And in jQuery and jQuery widgets, inside of the instance, we use selectors to grab, into the DOM, pull out the DOM nodes and manipulate the DOM all the time. And in Knockout, the view model ideally knows nothing about the DOM, right? So it's almost like Magento 2 using dependency injection, and in Magento 1 using Mage get model with some identifier to pull in the models that we need. So they're contrary paradigms, and mixing them together was a really bad idea. So in the spirit of Mage Talk episode 165, how dare you, Magento? How dare you mix these paradigms, right? So I really hope jQuery UI widgets get kicked out sooner or later. They're not a good idea in there. I mean, they do their job, but it's, yeah. So it's all about coupling. Either we couple the template to the view model or the view model to the template. Coupling them both ways is always a bad idea. Okay, and then of course, inconsistent use in the core. Enough said. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about self-documenting code. That's just my rules that I try to focus on when writing code, and that applies especially to this UI component thing, because it doesn't help us do it anyway. I try to follow the 4 rules of Kent Beck, which are passes all test, secondly, reveals intent, thirdly, no duplication, and finally, fewest elements, and those are in order of priority. But rule 2 and 3 can also be swapped or written on the same level, because they're kind of alternate actually during development, right? Focusing on one forces us to focus on the other again afterwards. So passes all test means the code has to work. And please note that it doesn't say we have to have automated tests or manual tests. All it says is we built something for a purpose, and that purpose should be fulfilled. And that's a given, of course. That's the highest priority. If that isn't fulfilled, nothing else matters. Secondly, reveals intent. What can I do to write code that reveals intent? And that's this whole idea of self-documented code for me, and I'm kind of into that. So, reveals intent is a lot about good naming, descriptive base class names. That's more for the PHP side, but if I import a class, I want to still be able to understand what it is. So if I have something called abstract, not good, right? So then naming functions should be about the intent of the functions, not the implementation. Descriptive property names and variable names, you get the idea. Here's one of my favorite little examples for something that's not quite descriptive. So we have an interface, a button provider interface, and a method get button data, right? Looks good and nice and clean. However, what does this get, if I want to implement this interface, what does get button data return, right? Something like this. How do I know what keys should I specify in the map? And I love maps. Maps are a great data structure, but why do I need an interface for something like this? Why don't not just use an array, right? So class name, is it names maybe too, right? Or what's the difference here? And do I have to specify data attribute or not? I don't know. I have to look at the implementation. So instead of creating interfaces like that, maybe it's better to write something like this. Much easier to use, right? It's immediately clear what should be done. Something like this is another point. So especially in the view, when we're rendering things, we need getters. So I'm not completely opposed against getters. Sometimes we just need a name, right? But this kind of code can often lead to situations where we're writing conditional expressions. For example, if get sort order equals ascending, do this, otherwise do that. And it's much nicer to have methods like this, because then we have the actual state values encapsulated in the function, and inside of the other code that uses it, we don't have to couple it into the internals, right? Something that's not quite as obvious is maybe when I'm writing code in a team, I always try to follow the practice that I try to write the code that it won't surprise any of the people in the team. So depending on what they're familiar with, that's how I try to write my code. Because honestly, there's so many coding styles, and they're all okay. It's just what we're used to, right? That's easy to read. So maybe it's a good idea to put a model or a class into a model directory or into a helper directory, because that's what people would expect. Anything else might be violating the principle of least surprise, right? So just because we have the freedom to do what we want to do, you know, we can also choose to follow commonly well-known conventions. Not a bad thing necessarily. And finally, I try to favor UI component JSON when I write UI components myself instead of using XML, because if you look at this, that's a simple part of a UI component configuration here. It's a progress bar, so maybe something out of checkout right here. And just notice the mental effort it takes to parse this. And then compare this to this. And notice how relaxing it is to view this instead, right? It's like, oh, yeah, easy to read, much easier. So I get the idea of the XML, it's extensible, and you know, we have the load order, we can override values, but almost all the code I write is for one specific instance. I don't need that. So it's much easier and maintainable to write JSON instead. All right, so what about no duplication? For me, that's a lot about keeping information or keeping knowledge in one place. Duplication is such a common thing in Magento 2, right? We've got EAV, and I specify properties and attributes and data types and labels, and then I have to specify the exact same thing again in UI component XML, or maybe in data interfaces, and now we're getting GraphQL, so we have to configure the whole thing again, right? So I must admit this is aimed somewhat at Andrew again, so because I know he's collecting feedback of how to build the new PWA front end. Just saying, duplication. It would be so nice if we just were able to specify a new attribute, for example, in one place, and then Magento just would use that information wherever it needs it, right? Instead of having to do it again and again and again. So, otherwise, in terms of UI components, this is a very common form of duplication. Selectors. Any kind of selectors is a piece of knowledge. That knowledge is in the DOM, and if we use the same selector in the models, that's duplicate knowledge. And some stuff like this just makes me a little sad, right? So we've got big chunks of DOM structure straight in the model. And that's a form of coupling and duplication. And what's worse, they're in different files and different layers of the application, right? We have the template layer, we have the model layer, and sometimes I agree, sometimes we do need the selectors, especially when working with existing code. But ideally, I would try to keep them as close as possible, if possible, in the same file. So for example, if I want to configure a selector here for this div, I would try to put it into the JSON in the same file, right? Like here, instead of putting it into the model, just pass it in. If I have it in the same file, the chances that I remember to update it or know where it's coming from or how it's used, it's much easier to read and to parse. Same for UI component names, right? So here, if I want to duplicate knowledge right here. So keep them close together. And if I have two components and they need to know about each other, so here thing A and thing B needs to know about thing A, yeah, why not place them as close as possible together and put the selector, the name, right here. Now, one thing I like a little bit better than specifying selectors is injecting DOM nodes into knockout. It seems like a a violation of the idea of knockout yet again, which is the view model should know about the DOM. But let's face it, in reality, quite often we do need to add stuff or read stuff out of the DOM after all. But instead of using selectors to grab out, we can just configure a binding, something like this, and create a binding, which is quite straightforward. So here we're adding this bind DOM node binding. And the init function receives a bunch of arguments. In this case, we just need 3 of them. The first one is the element that contains the binding. Then we have the value accessor, which gives us the value of the expression on the right side. And finally, the binding context. And the binding context contains the view model here. That's the $data. So we can place the element into the view model. And then inside of our view model, we can easily access the DOM node. For example, to get the bounding rectangle. Of course, we could have created a binding to inject the bounding rectangle directly too, right? So I have had good experiences with creating custom bindings instead of using selectors. So what about fused elements? That's a quick one. If something works, if it expresses intent, and if it contains no duplication, maybe we don't need to split it out any further. So the single responsibility principle is not the single public method principle. So that's something I've seen become quite popular, but if things belong together, we might as well keep them together. Okay, so finally, let's move on, talk a bit about state management. And in this context here, I want to make sure we're talking about Magento as it is. So this is not about PWAs or SPAs, this is about server-rendered pages. And inside of the page, we have a bunch of little apps or UI components, maybe the mini card, maybe a gallery, maybe a slider, whatever. And they all have their more or less independent state, right? And the reason why I think state is so interesting is because most of the bugs I encounter and create lie in this area. State becomes inconsistent or invalid, something the developer or me hadn't expected. So that's one of the most challenging parts. Generally, working with state, I think we have 3 options. We can keep the state in the DOM or in the UI components, or we can pass the state from the root UI component into the children UI components, or we can keep the state outside of the view. So, who's familiar with this little thing? Does it look familiar to somebody? So this is a tic-tac-toe game, which is part of the React tutorial. Who did that tutorial, by the way? So I think most people who want to learn React probably start with that. Oh, not so many. Oh well. Anyway, I used this as an example to re-implement it in UiComponents. It's on GitHub if you want to check it out after the talk. And I used it to implement a very naive, simple example for each of the 3 approaches, right? So if you're interested, check it out. So first of all, if you want to keep the state in the DOM or in the UI components, that's something that's actually only suitable for the most simple use cases. And that would be pure knockout, for example, or pure jQuery. jQuery usually uses state in the DOM. And what I mean by that is it could be a value in a form element, or CSS class names, like we set an active flag or a hidden flag or stuff like that, or styles directly, or element attributes, right? So that's state, we can set it in the DOM, we can read it from there, and that's how we can construct our application. I did that a lot, actually, right? That's prototype jQuery. And this would be a typical example. So I grabbed that somewhere out of the core, we remove event handlers, we have a selector, grab some stuff, add properties and styles and so on. So that's keeping state in the DOM. And on a knockout side of things, it's very comparable. We keep the state and properties on the view model, right? So, and if we want to share that state, that would be imports, export links, etc. Here's an example from my little example module here. So we link to stuff, we have properties, and then we use those properties inside of our functions to manipulate the state here. So that's keeping state in the view model. And interestingly, it's almost the same. If I keep the state in the view model, or if I keep the state in the DOM, the consequences are pretty much the same. Just work with them in slightly different syntax. But the problem is, it creates a very strong coupling between components that share that state, right? Either they both have to read from the same DOM element, or they read and write, or they both have to read and write from the same UI component, the same kind of coupling. So in this approach, interestingly enough, if there is derived state, so component A maybe uses a list of totals to calculate the grand total, right? Just a bad example maybe. Then the derived state is quite often set on the actual model. So just to indicate this, here's an example of derived state. So here, this foo property is derived from the bar property of some other view model. And I find when the state is stored directly in a UI component or the DOM, this is a common approach. And I want to contrast that to something like this, where the derived state is just a function of the original state, the source state, where it derives from, right? And of course, this is a lot more stable, because which one is more likely to get out of sync, right? This one can't get out of sync. So if I have the chance to derive my state as a function of the original state, that's superior. And just an observation I made over time, somehow people tend to just calculate some state and set it again in this first approach. All right, so let's have a look at the second approach. If we pass the state down from a root component into its children, and that's something that's, for example, done in a pure React application, and it works quite well, this approach, if it's within a single like hierarchy of components, right? So it's not limited to one component. Here's an example from the React tic-tac-toe tutorial. We can see a board component, and it receives some properties from its parent, and then that in turn passes it on to its children squared components in the tic-tac-toe game, and it just kind of cascades through. But of course, the problem is when the state is required outside of that one hierarchy. Suddenly, we have the same kind of coupling that we had in the original state when each component just maintained its own state. It's not a common approach in Magento 2. Actually, I haven't seen it in the core at all, but it's common in other frameworks, so that's why I wanted to include it here. We can use it in Magento 2, and there's, interestingly enough, not a callback on the parent when a child is added, but there's a callback on the child that's being added in a container which receives the parent, so then the child can grab into the parent and pull out any state it needs. It's a little weird because, again, in my mind, the parent should know about the child, but the child should know about the parent, right? And this creates this two-way coupling again, so it's a little awkward. It certainly works. All right, so again, not very useful, so let's move on to keeping state outside of the view. And that's pretty much what the Elm architecture or React, Redux, the whole Flux architecture does. I don't really know who came up with it first, Elm architecture or Flux through Facebook or someone else, but there certainly are differences here. So all these different libraries and frameworks use different names for the same things, right? Reducers, mutations, reactions, actions, methods, queries. Under the hood, it's similar. Some favor or enforce immutabilities, others don't. But they all share one thing in common, and that is they all keep the view outside of the view, the state outside of the view, sorry. So we could, of course, go ahead and implement many of the other characteristics because it's JavaScript after all, but I don't think that's worth the effort, right? We're still dealing with Magento's UI components, but it does have a big effect if we actually take the state out of the view. And in UI components, it would look something like this. So this is a typical little state object of mine. It's its own little module, and it contains the state I need. And I pass it to KO track to turn it into observable properties. And then inside of my view models, I depend on the state and use it. Hopefully, I can use functions to derive the view state out of the state object and don't have to maintain additional state. any state that's shared in any way certainly should not be part of the UI component, but instead reside inside of the state object. There's a slightly more complex example I built, which is a little breakout game. It's just UI components, and so we have the frame, the actual game, right? And then we have the game frame, and the scoreboard, and the wall, and the pedal, and the ball, and the bricks, and all of those are interdependent, right? So we have to have collision detection and so on. And works fine using UI components. So here we have the different state objects, for example. This is just an example where I decided to, initially I put everything into one state object and it worked, but it got rather large. So instead I said, oh, let's break them apart, and it turned out rather nicely. So each of the UI components has its own little state object, which might be used by others too who require it. And then I can define my properties. So here the frame width is always 98% of the game width. And because game width is observable as soon as it's changed, this here becomes a computed function, knockout computed, immediately the frame adjusts. And so I can have a nice, almost reactive way of developing with UI components, and it works pretty well. Yeah, so the benefits of keeping the state outside of the view is it's simple to share, right? So that's the main big benefit, of course. It just depends on the state object and we're good. View metals kind of collapse down to contain only the logic that I need, and that means less code, easier to maintain and understand. All right, so to summarize, my recommendation for maintainable UI components would be my code needs to pass all tests, need to reveal intent, contain no duplication, and have the fewest possible elements, and finally keep the state out of the view, and everything becomes much easier and saner. All right, so thanks for Kent for his brilliant 4 rules, and thank you for listening. And I hope we maybe have some time for questions. I'm not sure. Great.